Hey, fellow foodies, Dr. Cassandra Quave here, and you are listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. I am loving these early days of spring here in Atlanta, but at the same time, I'm also counting down the days until June. I'm going to be leading an international field expedition with 8 collaborating scientists from the US, Italy, Spain, the UK, and Kosovo in the Haas region of Albania and Kosovo in just one more month. In addition to documenting the trade and use of wild medicinal plants found in these mountains, we're also going to be training local students in field research techniques. But we need your help. We are crowdfunding this expedition using the Emory University Momentum platform. Our goal is to raise $10,000 to support the expedition expenses and to train local scientists. We're only 1% there in meeting our goal, so I really need your help. And whether you can give $10 or $100, every bit goes a really long way, and all of the funds go directly to supporting the expedition. Nothing is lost to crowdfunding platform fees because this is done directly through my university's giving page mechanism. And as an added bonus, your donation is tax deductible in the US. So head over to momentum.emory.edu/quave. I'll also add the web link to the show notes, and you can also find the web link at Foodie Pharmacology on our social media pages. So again, it's momentum.emory.edu/quave. All right. We have a super special episode for you today. We're getting back to one of my favorite topics, the ethnobotany of home gardens. Medicinal plants are the primary source of medicine in many parts of the world, and the cultivation and sharing of plant medicines in communities is incredibly important to supporting local community health. Our guest today is Amanda Thiel, and she'll be sharing some insights from her dissertation research on medicinal plants and home gardens of the Quechimaya people of Guatemala. We'll be discussing her recent paper just published in the journal Economic Botany on this very topic. Before we get started, let me tell you a bit more about Amanda. She's currently working towards her PhD in anthropology at Washington State University under the mentorship of Dr. Marcia Quinlan. Her interests focus on medical ethnobiology in Latin America with present work in Maya communities. She uses ethnographic methods to study people's interrelationships with the environment in order to revitalize cultural practices and identities and inform theories of culture and its change. Her research approach emphasizes collaboration with Indigenous peoples and local communities in support of their self-determination. She's been involved in research projects in Mexico, Guatemala, and the US. Amanda's background is in herbal medicine, and when she's not conducting ethnobotanical research, she also enjoys foraging for wild plants and other active pursuits in nature. That's something that clearly resonates with my heart and something I love to do as well. So thanks so much for coming on the show, Amanda. It's really great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So why don't we start with just some of the basics? Why don't you situate us in this amazing field research site where you're doing work with the Quechimaya people in Guatemala?
Sure. So the village I've been working in is called Santa Lucia La Chua, Santa Lucia for short. And it's a village of about 700 people in northwestern Guatemala, so in the Department of Alta Verapaz. So it's really hot. It's a lowland area, so it's tropical, rainy and warm for the most part. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful area, lots of native bromeliads and orchids and palms. And then people there cultivate maize or milpa horticulture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nice. So tell us a little bit about the process of acquiring food and of acquiring medicines. We've talked about, traditional agricultural systems in many different parts of the world, but what is it like there on a day-to-day basis? Like, what are the typical household activities like?
Yeah, so people live in homes on what they call lotes, which we would call home gardens, probably.
Mhm.
And so it's a parcel of land with trees, sometimes bushes, sometimes, and whatever plants people have either cultivated or that have just naturally popped up. There's a lot of little wild chili plants that birds seed into the gardens, and so they just grow naturally. And so people live in little compounds like this, and with either thatch home roofs or sometimes corrugated metal roofs,
Mhm.
sometimes plank homes, sometimes cement block homes. And then they cultivate their crops for subsistence and for sale elsewhere. So in that picture you just saw, there was corn in the foreground, which is actually somewhat unusual. This is a home on the outskirts of the town, and so it's closer to the more agricultural areas. But most homes are all grouped in the center of town, and then people walk to their milpa or their cornfield
Okay.
outside of town.
Nice. It's kind of like that in Italy where I've done a lot of field work, is you have everyone is kind of in the center and then yeah, you go out into the fields in the day. And so who's doing what types of labor? Because I think that also impacts really the relationships that people have with their environment and also who holds the knowledge for different types of plant uses.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, predominantly men are working in the agricultural fields, growing corn and pineapples and what have you. And then women are centered around the homes. And so it doesn't mean that men won't also tend the home gardens. They absolutely will. But predominantly the time spent in and around the home is done by women. And that coincides, with their other daily tasks like food preparation. So easier to be at home doing that and watching over the children and
Yeah,
whatnot. Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about medicine and, the access to medicine, whether it is traditional medicine or if it's Western biomedicine. What does healthcare look like in a community like this?
Yeah, so people are really relying on home remedies. Like you mentioned earlier, the majority of the world is
Mhm.
using plant medicine. So, like 80% of the world relies on plant medicine for their primary healthcare. And that's definitely true in this area. Home remedies, whether they're from medicinal plants that people are growing, or even if they're store bought medicines,
Mhm.
people are administering them at home and they're not going to healthcare practitioners very often. So in this particular village, this is especially the case because there's only one very minimally staffed health center.
Mhm.
There's a nurse there maybe twice a month, and they come in to give immunizations and see people that really need it, but only very sporadically. And then a hospital is the next closest healthcare facility, which is it's a good 45-minute drive away, and no one has cars, so you have to get on public
Yeah.
transportation to get there. So you're really, taking care of yourself and your family and your friends in this particular setting.
Yeah. Well, and so who are the caregivers? I know in some cultures, it's not uncommon to find the elder women, the head of household, that like the eldest grandmother will treat their children and grandchildren. But in other communities, instead, there are specialist healers that people go to. And so, kind of, what's that look like
Yeah,
in
so
this community?
in this community, there are some healers. There are three curanderos, which are like the
Hmm.
folk healers who often use herbs, but sometimes other methods of healing too. There used to be midwives, but there aren't anymore. It's kind of an issue across Guatemala where midwifery practice is really being subsumed by biomedicine for better and worse. Um, there's a lot of pros and cons to each avenue, but
Hmm.
there are no longer midwives in this particular area. So, by and large, it's everyone, lay people treating their families. Sometimes this is
Hmm.
the women, sometimes men. It kind of depends on the family context and who seems to have more knowledge of these traditions. But it seems that everyone has at least some knowledge of how to care for themselves and their families with plants.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the methods that go into this kind of research study. And maybe you can share with the listeners, how do you glean information on knowledge of plants and which plants are grown in home gardens versus which ones are being wild harvested and who's using plants in certain ways? What are some of the research methods that you use to get that information?
Yeah, great. Well, most anthropological work starts with what we call participant observation. So I'm there, I'm participating in activities, and I'm also observing and asking questions and going along with the pace of life there. So, I'm hanging out and peeling corn kernels off the cobs as they've come in from harvest, and going to plant pineapples with family members. And basically just asking questions the whole time. So that's where participant observation kind of makes way into informal interviewing. But then there are more formal interviews too. So the way that I was doing research about home gardens was I was visiting folks in their homes, asking, for permission and asking if they'd be interested in talking with me about the plants they have growing in their gardens. And then if they were interested and willing and had time, then we would usually walk through their gardens. So this would be called like a plant walk tour.
Mm-hmm.
And I just point to plants or wait for them. If they were especially interested in the topic, they would often just, start pointing to plants and say, oh, do you know about this one? This is what its name is. This is how we use it. And if they didn't just readily offer that information, I would probe a little bit, so like, oh, I see this plant here. It's so pretty. It has purple flowers. What do you call it? And try and ask for it in different languages, because in this village, I was communicating in Spanish, but the first language is Quechua, which is a Maya language.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would ask for the Quechua name as well, or any other names that they knew for plants. And then additional information about each plant. So go through methodically to ask about, how you use something, what the amount you would need to make tea, or whatever the preparation was for each one. So those were the main methods, and then also some follow-up interviews just to ask for clarification and additional information where it wasn't obvious to begin with.
That's great. Well, and one other thing I wanted to dive into, because I know you're really passionate about this too, is research ethics. Can you tell us, like, what does it mean to conduct this kind of sociocultural work under the paradigm of ethics in anthropology?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's really important to talk about. So obviously in institutions, we have sort of like ethical review boards that monitor what we do, and they ask, what are the questions you're going to ask and how are you going to get permission? And that's all super important. But then another step is that we have to discuss all of our plans and our ideas with the people we're actually working with, and make sure that it's cool with them. Because if it's not, what are we doing? That doesn't. So I heard an ethics professor once say that ethics is about flourishing. And I just love that, because it makes me think, one, about plants, but also just about relationships and how it's important that we all work together towards really flourishing relationships based on trust and respect. So going in with that sort of premise is important. And then having conversations with the appropriate sort of governance structures that are in place locally is really important. So talking with the governing council of this village is a step that I took at the very outset of my research.
Mm-hmm.
I went and I, befriended some folks in the village, and I said, this is what I'm interested in doing. Who should I talk to? And they said, oh, well, you should talk to our governing council. And so I did that and went through a process of really outlining the terms of the research in a really clear way, so that everyone knew what was going on and everyone was on board. And there was a little bit of negotiation, but not really much, because we were really open and clear about what we wanted to do. And I was very explicit in saying that, if at some point you don't like what's happening here, just tell me to leave and I'll be out of here, because I don't want to step on any toes. I don't want to, overstep any sort of boundaries or extend people's goodwill too far. So, but people were extremely supportive and interested in this kind of work and in documenting traditional knowledge for the benefit of current and future generations. And so it was really interesting to them, and they really readily agreed. So then another step beyond that is to go, for each interview, you have to ask for free, prior, and informed consent. So each person that I wanted to talk to, I'd say, this is what I'd like to do, what I'd like to ask you about, what I'd like to do with the information. Are you okay with that? And if they said no, which happened once or twice, I would say, okay, great. I wish you well. See you later. And move on to the next person. But by and large, everyone wants to talk about their lives and their plant knowledge. So it was pretty easy to stimulate these conversations.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think this is so important, especially, there are a lot of students that listen to this podcast. And I think, having that appreciation for ethics at the outset and again, the focus on clarity is so important
Yeah.
to building
So
trust with communities.
right, for all the students out there and anyone really interested in doing research with indigenous or local communities, I would suggest looking at the codes of ethics that are, relevant to the site that you're working in. So there's the International Society of Ethnobiology that has a great code of ethics, and then the Latin American Society of Ethnobiology also has one, which is similar but also particular to Latin America. So just check out what's relevant to wherever you're working or want to work, and proceed from there.
It's awesome. All right. Well, let's get into the plants because, that's what gets me really excited, and I'm sure it does some of the audience. And, maybe we can start with some of the exciting plants that you noted that were growing in these gardens. Were there a mix of edible and medicinal plants? Were there any cases where plants could serve as food and medicine? And what did that look like?
Absolutely. So a lot of the plants that people are growing in their gardens have multiple uses. So food, medicine, shelter, or even like fences and denoting boundaries between
Hmm.
different homes, um, and ornamental uses. There are lots of beautiful flowers. So there's all sorts of different uses. Avocado was like a really common plant there. And of course, people eat the avocados, but then they also make medicine from different parts of the avocado. The same is true for lots of different fruit trees, mangoes, oranges, limes. Yeah. So,
Interesting. So how do you make medicine out of avocados? I just had avocado last night
yeah,
with my dinner. I love avocados. But like,
yeah.
what parts are they using? What are
Well,
they
it's,
using it
it's not
for?
the fruit. You would either be using the leaves or the
Hmm.
bark or the pit. Um,
Oh, cool.
yeah, for various uses. Oftentimes like stomach upset, diarrhea,
Hmm.
ulcers, sometimes also skin problems.
Hmm.
Um, one pattern that I noticed was that a lot of the fruit trees, their leaves are considered to be cooling if you make a tea from them, and so
Hmm.
anything related to fevers or overheat could be helped with a lot of those
Interesting.
fruit tree leaves. Yeah.
That's great. And so you have lots of fruit trees and they're eating the fruits, they're using other parts of the tree as different medicines or even in construction. What about herbaceous plants? Were there any kind of, more of like herbs, seasonal herbs that are or are they just around all season in the tropics? Like what does that look like?
Right. So
Yeah.
a lot of them are. They might go through different periods of, expansion based on whatever rainy or dry season it is. Lemongrass was one particular herb that was commonly used. Yeah, here's one of my dear friends showing the lemongrass and explaining how it's used. What's really interesting about this plant too is that he's showing me this lemongrass plant, but it's actually growing in his neighbor's garden, not in his own. But um, it's just common practice to be so friendly with neighbors that like walking into the neighbor's garden and talking about their plants is like totally fine.
That's great.
Yeah. And so this particular plant, he was telling me that this lemongrass is used for coughs and for fevers. And I saw that actually in action a few weeks later when this particular villager's wife had a fever and a cough and a sore throat.
Mm.
And so I saw the lemongrass, steeping in her pot in her kitchen. So
Oh, nice.
pretty cool.
Yeah, I love lemongrass. It's one of my favorite herbs. I've been given it too for stomach upset before, just having it laid on my chest to inhale like the aromatherapy. So like there have
Ooh,
been, yeah, I don't know if they do that as well, just smelling it, not even drinking it, but it is delicious
it is
in
really
teas
delicious.
and soups. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
another herb that they commonly use is rue, which is
Hmm.
another aromatic plant. It doesn't smell quite as pleasantly citrusy as lemongrass does, but I still
Yeah.
really like it. It's very pungent smelling. And this is often used for kids and used to bathe kids, especially when they have symptoms of what they call mal ojo or evil eye.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Is it Ruta graveolens or do you remember the species?
it's Ruta chalapensis, so it's a specific
Chalapensis. Yeah.
to that area. Yeah.
So here's something that's gonna blow your mind. They do the same thing in the islands off the coast of Sicily.
Oh, I believe it. It's so
It's like
widespread. Rue for that particular treatment is very common cross culture.
yeah.
It's pretty
Yeah,
fascinating.
it's interesting. Like Evil Eye has this interesting spread across the Mediterranean and into Latin America. And in Italy, it's Malocchio, or
Mhm.
Evil Eye, and in Mal di Ojo. Yeah, it's fascinating how you can have these traditions that are spread so far across the globe with different names, but often a lot of the similar remedies for it.
Right.
It's kind of
Well,
yeah.
stay tuned. I'm writing a paper about Malojo and its treatments in this particular
Oh,
village, so that'll
very
come out.
nice.
In,
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. Well,
yeah.
and rue, just for the pharmacology buffs in the audience, rue is an interesting plant as well because it's in the citrus family, right? But it also contains these sorolins, which can cause DNA photo cross linking basically. And there've also I've seen before where teas of rue are taken in certain ritual contexts, but can also be a little bit toxic and you can get some some phototoxicity, especially. um but yeah, a really interesting, very powerful medicinal plant, often associated with like spiritual ailments and
Absolutely.
like witchcraft, even in some cultures. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I
such
can
a
speak
neat
to its,
plant.
its sort of slightly toxic effects because I was making a tea from rue. I'm grow up plant of it on my porch here,
Hmm.
even in Washington State. I like
Oh,
to bring
cool.
home whatever. I didn't bring this particular plant home, but I like to bring home the knowledge and infuse
Hmm.
that into my life here. And so I was like, okay, I'll try this rue tea, and oh, it really upset my stomach, and it started making me sweat and start to feel numb in my hands. I was like, okay, just after half a cup of tea, I think this is not the tea for me.
It's very powerful. I do not recommend
It is.
taking teas of rue.
No, it's
Yeah.
very powerful. Yeah, but that's part of the
Yeah.
beauty too, used appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Very cool. So you've got rue, you've got lemongrass, you have fruit trees. What about mints? Are they using any members of the Lamiaceae family kind of in teas or?
Um, Only basil, as far as I can remember.
Mhm.
There might have been a spearmint in one person's garden, but I was surprised actually not to find more because mints are often very common cross culturally.
Yeah.
But yeah, but so they were using basil as I think a stomach ache remedy,
Mhm.
and then also just as a condiment in food,
It's great.
and then spearmint as well. Mhm.
Yeah. And what about chili peppers? Because you were mentioning how kind of chilies pop up in the wild. Are they also using those in some context medicinally or?
Um, you know, the leaves they're using medicinally because they consider them to be cooling.
Mhm.
But I don't know about the fruits. I never heard anyone mention that. And actually, even the fruits, some people eat them, but it's not as common to eat spicy food in this part of the world
Oh,
as I thought
interesting.
originally going there. So I really like spicy food, and every day at meals I would say, "Oh, where's the chili? Can I have a little extra chili for my tortillas and beans, please?" Yeah, so
That's great.
not as common as I would have thought. Yeah.
Cool. Well, one of the things I really liked about your paper was this exploration of kind of communal resource sharing as a means of reinforcing health security. And in addition to like growing, cultivation of herbs, not all people cultivate their medicinal plants. This is important to note. Like there are many examples of other cultures where they primarily wildcraft their medicinal plants and then store them dry at home. So it's not in every culture that you grow your medicinal plants, but it's very common here that they're growing these plants. Some are used as food, some as medicine. But there's also this idea of reciprocity and of sharing and helping. So what can you tell us about that? Like how that works within the community?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. So variation in cultural knowledge, like in cultural knowledge about plants, is actually really extensive, especially I noticed in this village. And that could be for a lot of different reasons. But one could be that people have lived in this area for only about 40 years because
Mm,
they left from other parts of Guatemala to this area back when there was a really intense state conflict. And so they were looking for land, but they were also looking for safety. And so, 1980 was when this village was founded. So people haven't been
Wow.
living there all that long. And so they're bringing knowledge from other parts of the country, most likely. And then also, new practices are always intermixing. So there's a lot of sort of turnover of knowledge or contribution to knowledge, which can make it very variable. And then another aspect of that is that since there were people coming from different parts of Guatemala, while it is a predominantly Quechua Maya village, there are also Ladino, which are like a mestizo or mixed ethnicity group. And there are other Maya groups too, Pocomchi, Cacchiquel, and Mam. And so there's like this confluence of different factors that could be contributing to variation. And one of the things that all that variation in knowledge and practice of cultivating medicinal plants affords is that some people know some things or have certain plant resources and others don't. And what's beautiful in this area is that there's a lot of sharing. And so, like, for example, the lemongrass that my friend was showing me, he's showing me his friend's plant and later his wife is using it, right? And so there's really a generosity of spirit in terms of sharing the resources that people have here, which is born out of necessity, but also out of just the goodwill that people have for one another. And so, and this picture here too, friends invited me to harvest this malanga plant and cook it up. And so, they're very generous with what they have and want for people to be well. And so sharing knowledge, sharing resources is a big part of their traditional medicine and their lives here.
That's really great. Yeah, there's something really there's something just really wonderful about that, about the sharing of plants and of knowledge. And some of my favorite gifts that I have from my neighborhood and just the broader community in Atlanta have been plants. Like someone will bring me a cutting of a plant and I'm like, and it's just a gift that keeps giving, because then as it goes into flower, I think of that person and it just makes, yeah,
well, and too, like, in our context, everyone in the summer has a problem with like having too many zucchinis, right? So like, you don't want everyone growing zucchinis, or you might even think like, maybe I won't grow zucchinis this year because like, I know my neighbor has some and everyone always has extras. So I'm sure I'll get some, maybe I'll grow something else that I can gift them in return. And it's kind of this idea that seems to be in practice in this village in Guatemala where, people are sharing and they can really be interdependent that way. In the resources they have and in the knowledge that they have of those resources.
Well, it's such a more efficient use of resources and of land when you use it in that way. It's kind of
Really
reciprocal
right.
exchange.
And it builds relationships, which is a really beautiful part of it.
It's great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you as an anthropologist, what are some of the big takeaways that because you're documenting plants, plant uses, plant knowledge, but you're also taking a broader look at the cultural context of this knowledge. So what are some of the big takeaways that you have gleaned from this work from kind of the more anthropological perspective?
Sure. I would say that there's this sort of tension between practicing your traditions and inviting in new elements of like modern culture, even though all people living are modern people. I hate that phrase, but I think it illustrates sort of like the point about, like the Western influence on cultural traditions. And so people in this village, on the one hand, they really think that they have a lot of valuable cultural traditions, which they do clearly. But then they also are curious about, influences from the outside. And of course, that's natural. We're all curious, right? But I guess what is sort of hard for me, I guess, is that I want to really affirm their cultural traditions and not influence too much their change towards, things that aren't naturally part of their traditions. And so they'd ask me often when we were talking about plants, oh, well, what plants do you have? And so I might mention some, but I was trying to be careful not to say like, oh, I have this and this and I use it for this and that, because not that I don't want to share my experience, I do, but I don't necessarily want people to think, oh, I should be using plants that way too. So there's this delicate balance between like just really supporting what's already happening locally and then also having some sort of interaction with, connection to outside forces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a great point, because I mean, there have been many times where I'll often ask, people that I'm working with in communities about where they learned about this practice or that
Mhm.
practice. And I can tell you there have been a number of times where they've gone over to a bookcase.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
like, "Oh, here, I learned
Yeah.
about it by reading this herbalism book," and
Right.
and they're explaining. I was like, "Oh," because there's this preconception that, it has to be, from their grandmother or the healer in the village that
Mhm.
taught them, or
But it's not
which
always.
it's not always.
Right. Actually, I have a
I
funny story about that with the moringa tree, if you're familiar with it.
Mhm.
There were a handful of them growing throughout the village. And so in my plant garden tours, I was asking about moringa, and folks there kept saying, "Oh, well, it's used for 300 illnesses." And I was like, "Okay, like what?" And they'd list some like big things like diabetes and cancer, and but the way they talked about it was really interesting. It was very different than the way they talked about other plants, and
Mhm.
they all seemed to say the same thing. I heard it's for 300 illnesses 3 times, at least 3 times while I was there. And I was like, they're getting this information from someone, from somewhere that's like,
Yeah.
entering from outside. And sure enough, when I asked more about it, it was some sort of conservation and like restoration project that was trying to spread a plant, to try and reforest areas or whatever.
Put
But
moringa everywhere. Yep.
but also to like support traditional medicine, even though it's not a tradition in this area, it's a tradition in Asia. So that
Yeah,
was
that's an odd plant to, spread traditional medicine.
absolutely. I was like, why can't we spread the plants that are already growing here and that people have traditions of, so they don't have to. I mean, not that we don't want to learn new things, but I could tell that they hadn't quite practiced any of that medicine yet. It's for 300 illnesses, but I don't. But the other thing they said was, but I don't know how to use it. And it was
Yeah.
like, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks to the dynamic nature of the history of, medicinal plants. And I often get this question, from people where they'll say, "Well, how did people figure out how to use these medicines?"
Mhm.
Or especially where there's combinations, like how did they figure out to put this and this together? And
Right.
it's complicated. But there's this building of empirical evidence over time, and then sharing of knowledge, and then one person marries into another village, or someone travels through a village, or
Right.
today, it could be that they heard about it on the radio or on
Right.
TV or on
Right.
TikTok. I mean, it's like the mechanisms of knowledge exchange are just evolving so quickly.
Right.
Um, but at the same time, there's so much knowledge erosion with language loss. And you
Mhm.
mentioned that there are two languages spoken in this village.
Mhm.
Have you noted in the region, especially since they've already been part of a diaspora that was displaced by conflict in other parts of the country, have you seen language erosion in their indigenous language, or is that really stayed intact?
So what's neat about this particular place is that it has stayed intact somewhat.
Mhm.
There is a large sense of cultural pride around the Quechua language and around being Maya in general, which is
Mhm.
very different than some other parts of the Maya area. So in this village, people would say, "Somos Maya." We are Maya, and and they'd say it in a way that was like they'd
Pride.
stand up taller
Yeah.
and feel really proud of that, which was really beautiful to see. And even people who are Pokomchi or Mam or Kakchikel and have moved to this area, they're actually learning Kekchi because it's the sort of de facto language, you know. So
Okay.
so Kekchi is doing well in this particular area, but that's not the case for a lot of other languages, or
Mm.
maybe necessarily for Kekchi in another site, you know. And so there's definitely still Spanish language dominance in this whole area. But even in schools, kids are still learning Kekchi, and some of their textbooks are in Kekchi. And so
Mhm.
that's really, really neat for their language continuity.
That's great. Yeah, it's great that have it continued in schools. Well, when it comes to knowledge return and kind of, once you have this knowledge documented, what was the desire of the community? Like, did they have a desire to recapture this knowledge in some format or use it in some way for the purposes of serving the community?
Absolutely. So, yes, at the outset, one of the main um, things I kept hearing from people was, "Oh yeah, my grandmother practiced this," or we used to know this and now we're losing it. So we want to keep this knowledge intact. doing that is one of the things that ethnobotanists can really help support, is to like, we're trained in like how to document information and how to analyze it. And like, we can fill that sort of gap where maybe there's not the know-how of how to do that in a community, but they have the know-how of the plants. And so working together, there can be this really beautiful mutualism develop where people can work together and document knowledge where they're wanting it to be documented and preserve it into the future. And one of the aims I had in working with these folks was to return the information to them in a way that was locally acceptable and appropriate. And that's a really actually hard thing to do. And it's not something that is emphasized enough in academia and in research generally. So I really made a point. Part of the reason I went back, so I went in 2016 and I went in 2018. And part of the reason I went back in 2018, aside from just loving the people I met and wanting to see them again, was to bring back information. So at that point, I had written a thesis about medicinal plants. I translated it into Spanish. I brought it back. I'm not sure that anyone read it, but at least it's there. And then what I did was I also took little bits of the information, extracted it into a smaller sort of like brochure size pamphlet that people could use. And it was really telling, actually. I felt great about doing this, and I felt like, okay, at least it's something, that's being returned to them. So they have not only the information written down, but also like for anyone in the future that wants to see it, either to use it or just to feel affirmed that their knowledge matters.
Yeah.
That felt really good to me. But then I get there and of course people were like, oh, thank you, this is great. But also I had one person say, well, actually, he didn't say anything. I handed him the info and explained what it was. And he hands it to his granddaughter and says, here you go. You can have it. And I was trying to figure out what's going on. Does he not care or what? And through a process of conversation, I realized that he doesn't read or write. And so it was useless to him. But he said, oh, well, she can read it to me. And tell me what's in there. So that was kind of a humbling moment where I was like, oh no, like,
yeah, you want to make it like where it works. Yeah, it's like, how do you, well, do they have access to power or electricity for video or anything there? Or
so most folks have electricity, but not all. And
yeah,
TVs are not very common. So yeah,
so that's the balance, is like, how do you find the right
common? So yeah, I think that there's the potential for for video, but it's all like a process of figuring out what works in a particular situation and context and working.
I think you're absolutely right though with this. I mean, it's not emphasized enough in academia, and it needs to be. I mean, I think doing the effort of taking a scientific work, like a research paper, but making that into a format that's accessible in the local language, that's not in like science speak, but like in accessible language, that's quite an endeavor. And it is really important. I wish that could be counted as, towards dissertations as like a body of the work, and hopefully it will be for yours, because it is an important contribution and should be something that all of us are doing, who work with Indigenous groups and with local communities.
Absolutely. It's their knowledge. It's for them. They are the ones who, want to continue using it and perpetuate the knowledge, and any effort we can make to support that direction is really a good one.
That's great. All right. So as we're wrapping up, I have to ask you, this is a question I like to ask all of my guests. And can you share with us one of your favorite recipes from this region? Like, I know you mentioned chili peppers, which aren't quite typical to the area, but like, what was your favorite type of meal there? And do you have any advice? Like, can it be made with the ingredients that are accessible to us here?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So absolutely. I mean, this is going to sound silly, but one of my favorite meals was refried beans.
I love refried beans.
It's just so simple, but so delicious and just so sustaining. And it's like all local ingredients and just super tasty. But then I would also say, so there were malanga plants, which we harvested and made into like 3 different types of preparations, like kind of like mash. It's like a starchy.
That's what to ask. Like, what is
Yeah.
malanga? Because like I don't think I've even ever tried it before.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's very much like a starchy potato, only a lot larger. So you can prepare it like kind of like mashed potatoes and salt and water, or with sugar, and then it's like a sweet sort of starchy meal. And then we also sliced it and fried it sort of like a potato chip, and that was really tasty too. So that was fun. If you're in the tropics, you can do that, but not so much in the temperate climate like where I'm at right now. So I stick with refried beans now to put me in the mood of, you know, being back in the village and thinking about all my friends there.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so what's next on your work in this region? Do you have plans for future studies?
Yeah, so I have actually started another project just right across the border in Mexico, in southern Mexico, and it's more focused on food and traditional food and how to really engage youth in perpetuating knowledge about traditional food, and so using a lot of participatory video and things like that. But I'm also working more with medicine too, and doing some studies there, and hopefully continued studies in Guatemala in the future about traditional medicine and how to that same sort of issue of how to return information and perpetuate information and knowledge there that's really culturally appropriate, you know. So lots of different things going on, but it's a beautiful there's lots of beautiful opportunities.
That's great. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for coming on the show. This has been a lot of fun.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded for you today on Restream. I want to thank our producers, Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for pulling this together. And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in each week. Remember, you can catch this episode and all of our others, recent episodes on our YouTube channel at Teach Ethnobotany. And you can stream this podcast on any of your favorite streaming platforms. Remember, do me a favor, go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating. Even if you don't write anything down, just click those 5 stars. I'd really appreciate it. All right. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.